Welcome to Tony Byrne's View with news you can use. Tony has over 32 years of experience as a chartered financial planner and wealth manager. Tony's passion is to help you retire early and live the life of your dreams with no financial worries. Now to today's episode.
Why inflation destroys your savings and what to do about it. The rate of inflation as measured by CPI, that's Consumer Prices Index, is now at 5.1% for November, which is an increase from 4.2% for October. This is the highest level of inflation in the UK since 2011. However, RPI inflation was 7.1%, up from 6% the previous month. Bearing in mind that CPI inflation was just 0.7% in March last year, that represents a huge increase. Confusingly, there are now three rates of inflation: CPI, RPI and CPIH. These are all measures of inflation based on a shopping basket of goods and services. RPI stands for the Retail Prices Index, and it includes mortgage interest payments, so it is largely influenced by house prices and interest rates. CPI is Consumer Prices Index, which takes no account of housing costs, but includes all of the other goods and services. Then we have CPIH, Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupiers' housing costs. Uses a measure of rental equivalence to determine how much rent the householder would pay for an equivalent property. As you can tell from these different inflation rates, none of them are perfect because, of course, every person's situation is different. The reality is that we each have a personal inflation rate. The problem is that the government favours CPI over RPI mainly because the rate is usually lower than RPI. At least that's what the cynic in me believes. Because we have had such low inflation for many years, the threat of inflation has largely been overlooked, especially by younger generations who have never experienced it. As a young man in the 70s, I lived in a decade when inflation, as measured by RPI, averaged in the teens and peaked at 25% in 1975. Interest rates, as measured by the base rate, rose to a record high of 17% in November 1979. It all started when the Middle Eastern nations finally realised they had liquid gold, which they had been selling too cheaply, in other words, oil. That ended in 1974 when oil prices rose fourfold overnight. The price of petrol at the pumps rose by the same amount, a 300% increase overnight. This is what started the surge in inflation. Having lived through such extraordinary times, I've always been wary of the threat of high inflation and high interest rates because they are great destroyers of wealth if you're not invested in real assets, by which I mean assets that are capable of keeping pace with or beating inflation, such as property and shares. Let me explain by way of an example. Let's say you have £100,000 saved in a bank deposit account earning you 0.5% interest. At CPI inflation of 5.1%, you are losing 4.6% a year in real terms. In other words, inflation-adjusted terms. That's made up of 0.5% interest minus 5.1% inflation. At RPI inflation of 7.1%, you are losing 6.6% a year, inflation adjusted. That's 0.5% interest minus 7.1% CPI inflation. So, cash is trash, to quote Warren Buffett, when inflation is high. Another poor asset class when interest rates rise is bonds. If the ECB, that's the European Central Bank, increases the euro rate to just 2.5%, it is predicted that the value of bonds will fall by 30%. Some commentators have predicted that the value of bonds could fall as much as 70% over the next 10 years. Ouch! So what can you do about it? Well, one way to take advantage of rising inflation and increasing interest rates would be to invest in our discretionary fund management service, DFM in other words, which is run by our sister company, Minerva Money Management, on the Hubwise or Transact platforms. We launched the service a year ago. It consists of a portfolio of 15 to 18 funds, including the CCM Intelligent Wealth Fund, which is managed by Minerva Money Management. Expecting inflation and interest rates to rise a year ago, we deliberately positioned our DFM service to benefit from this likely scenario. We are invested primarily in shares, especially UK shares, which are at their most undervalued level compared to global equity since 1972. We also have exposures to commodities, including gold. Commodities are very undervalued, but are likely to rise strongly in value under an inflationary environment. Jim Mellon has recently been quoted predicting that gold will rise in value from $1,800 an ounce today to $5,000. We took the decision to not invest in bonds as it seems inevitable that their value will fall over the next decade and probably by a considerable amount. Why invest in an asset class which is doomed? So if you want to invest your money to protect it against the ravages of inflation, why not invest it in a portfolio of funds designed to thrive under such conditions? You know it makes sense.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share it with your friends and family. For more information, head to www.wealthandtax.co.uk.